The dust kicked up from my horse's hooves as I rode through the barren landscape of what folks called the Devil's Canyon. It was 1874, and I was nothing more than a drifter with a past I'd rather forget and a future that looked about as promising as rain in a drought. My name was William Will Harrison, though most people who knew me called me by names I wouldn't repeat in polite company. I had been running from my own shadow for 3 years now, ever since that night in Kansas City when everything I thought I was crumbled to dust. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when I heard it, a sound that cut through the desert's silence like a knife through butter. It was a woman's scream, sharp and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls. Now, any sensible man would have spurred his horse in the opposite direction. The wilderness was full of traps, and, more often than not, a woman's cry for help was bait in some elaborate scheme to separate a man from his money, his horse, or his life. But something about that scream, the raw terror in it, made me pull up short on the reins. My horse, a sturdy buckskin mare I'd named Conscience on account of how she always seemed to know the right path when I didn't, snorted and stamped her feet. She could sense my hesitation. For a moment, I sat there in the saddle, weighing my options. The smart thing would be to ride away. I'd spent the last 3 years perfecting the art of minding my own business, of not getting involved in other people's troubles. It had kept me alive and relatively free from complications. But that scream came again, closer this time, and with it came the sound of men's voices, rough, cruel laughter that made my blood run cold. Without really making a conscious decision, I found myself guiding Conscience toward the sounds. As we crested a small rise, I could see down into a shallow valley where a scene was playing out that made my jaw clench with anger. 3 men on horseback had cornered a young woman against a rocky outcropping. Her dress was torn, her dark hair disheveled, and even from a distance I could see the defiance blazing in her eyes. She was backed up against the rocks with nowhere to run, but she wasn't cowering. She held a broken piece of wood like a weapon, her chin raised in a way that spoke of courage born from desperation. The men were clearly enjoying themselves, taking their time, savoring her fear. The largest of them, a bear of a man with a greasy black beard, was saying something that made the other 2 laugh. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I'd seen this kind of situation before, and I knew exactly how it would end if no one intervened. This is where the old Will Harrison, the weak man I used to be, would have found a dozen reasons to ride away. He would have told himself it wasn't his fight, that he couldn't take on 3 armed men alone, that getting involved would only lead to trouble. The old Will was a master of justification, of finding noble-sounding reasons to do nothing when action was required. But something had been changing in me during these 3 years in the wilderness. The constant struggle to survive, the long nights under the stars with nothing but my own thoughts for company, the gradual stripping away of all the comfortable lies I'd told myself, it had all been working on me like water on stone, slowly wearing away the weak places until something harder was beginning to emerge. I checked my weapons, a Colt .45 on my right hip and a Winchester rifle in the saddle holster. 3 against 1 weren't good odds, but I'd faced worse. More importantly, I'd reached a point where I cared less about the odds than I did about being able to look at myself in a mirror afterward. I guided Conscience down the slope as quietly as I could, using the rocks and scrub brush for cover. The men were so focused on their prey that they didn't notice my approach until I was close enough to make out their individual features. That's when I called out, my voice carrying clearly across the small valley. "You boys seem to have gotten yourselves turned around. This here's private property, and the lady doesn't appear to be enjoying your company." The 3 men whirled around in their saddles, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The big man with the black beard seemed to be their leader. He looked me up and down with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. Well, what have we got here?" he said, his voice thick with a Texas drawl. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero, boys. You know what we do to heroes out here in the middle of nowhere, stranger?" "I imagine you tell them to ride away and mind their own business," I replied, keeping my voice steady and my hands visible but ready. "And I imagine most of them are smart enough to take that advice. But here's the thing, I never was accused of being too smart." The woman had stopped moving, pressed back against the rocks, her eyes darting between me and her tormentors. I could see her trying to figure out if I was help or just a different kind of trouble. In her position, I probably would have been wondering the same thing. You're making a mistake, friend, the leader said, his hand now resting openly on the butt of his pistol. There's 3 of us and 1 of you, and we've killed men for less than interfering with our business. Maybe so, I said, but here's what's going to happen. The lady is going to walk over here to my horse, she's going to climb up behind me, and we're all going to pretend this little meeting never took place. You boys can go back to whatever it is you do when you're not terrorizing defenseless women, and I'll forget I ever saw your faces. The leader laughed, a sound like broken glass. You got sand, I'll give you that. But sand ain't enough to stop 3 bullets. That's when everything went to hell. The man to the leader's left went for his gun first. He was fast, but desperation and righteous anger can make a man faster. My Colt cleared leather and barked once, twice. The man tumbled from his saddle before his weapon was fully drawn. The second man managed to get his pistol out, but his shot went wide as my second bullet took him in the chest. The leader was good, I'll give him that. His shot came close enough to part my hair, but by then, I was moving, throwing myself sideways in the saddle as conscience, trained by necessity to be a warhorse, danced away from the danger. My third shot took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. He managed to stay in his saddle, his left hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, his right still holding his smoking pistol. For a moment we stared at each other across the small valley, both of us breathing hard, both of us aware that the next few seconds would determine who walked away from this encounter. You're better than I figured, he said through gritted teeth. But this ain't over. It is if you're smart, I replied, keeping my gun trained on him. Take your friends and get out of here. Don't make me kill you. He looked at his 2 companions, one clearly dead, the other moaning softly in the dirt, and seemed to calculate his options. After a long moment, he holstered his weapon and dismounted to help the wounded man onto his horse. Without another word, he led both horses away, leaving the dead man behind. It wasn't until they disappeared over the ridge that I realized I was shaking. The old familiar feeling washed over me, the sick knowledge that I'd just taken a life, the weight of that responsibility settling onto my shoulders like a lead blanket. But this time was different. This time, I didn't feel the crushing guilt that had driven me into the wilderness 3 years ago. This time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long while, the satisfaction of having done the right thing. I turned my attention to the woman, who was still pressed against the rocks, staring at me with wide eyes. She was younger than I'd first thought, maybe 22 or 23, with striking green eyes and dark hair that fell past her shoulders. Her dress, though torn and dusty, was well made, suggesting she came from money or at least comfortable circumstances. "Ma'am," I said, tipping my hat. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly, as if coming out of a trance. No, they didn't, you arrived in time." I dismounted and walked over to her, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. Up close, I could see that she was trembling, but there was still that fierce light in her eyes, the same defiance I'd seen from a distance. "My name's Will Harrison," I said. "I'm going to help you get out of here, but first I need to know, are you hurt anywhere?" "Can you ride?" "I can ride," she said, her voice stronger now. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I was traveling to my uncle's ranch near Silver Creek when they... You don't need to explain," I said gently. "The important thing is you're safe now. But we need to get moving. That leader might decide to come back with reinforcements." She nodded and allowed me to help her to her feet. That's when I noticed the way she moved, graceful despite her ordeal, with an unconscious dignity that spoke of good breeding and education. This wasn't some frontier farm girl or saloon dancer. This was a lady, in every sense of the word. "Where's your horse?" I asked. "They ran it off when they first attacked. It's probably halfway to Mexico by now." I looked at Conscience, who had been standing patiently through the entire conversation. She was a strong horse, but carrying 2 people any significant distance wouldn't be easy on her. Still, it was better than leaving Elena out here alone. "All right then," I said. "You'll ride with me until we can find you another mount." "Silver Creek, you said?" "Yes, my uncle's ranch is about 5 miles north of the town. His name is Carlos Vasquez." He owns the largest spread in the valley. I helped her up onto Conscience's back, then swung up in front of her. Having a woman pressed against my back, her arms around my waist for balance, was a sensation I hadn't experienced in a long time. It brought back memories of a different life, before everything went wrong, when I'd been a different man with different possibilities stretching out before him. We rode in silence for the first hour, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that seemed to set the whole world on fire. It was beautiful country, despite its harsh reputation, all sweeping vistas and dramatic rock formations that made a man feel both insignificant and somehow more alive at the same time. It was Elena who finally broke the silence. "You saved my life back there. Those men, they would have." "Don't," I said. "You don't need to think about what might have happened. It didn't happen. That's what matters. But you could have been killed. You were outnumbered. Why did you help me?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since the moment I heard her scream. Why had I gotten involved? What was it about her situation that had called to something deep inside me, something I thought I'd buried along with the man I used to be? "I don't know," I said honestly. 3 years ago, I might have ridden right past. But a man can't run from himself forever. Eventually, he has to decide what kind of person he wants to be. What were you running from? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I was back in that saloon in Kansas City, looking down at the body of the young man I'd killed in what was supposed to be a fair fight but had turned into something uglier. The kid had been drunk, barely old enough to shave, and he'd called me out over some imagined slight involving a girl whose name I couldn't even remember now. I should have walked away. I should have let him save face and live to see another day. Instead, I'd let pride and whiskey make the decision for me. Myself, mostly, I said finally. The man I used to be. The things I'd done. Elena was quiet for a moment, digesting this. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. "My father always said that the measure of a man isn't in his mistakes, but in how he chooses to live with them." Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. He died 2 years ago. That's why I'm traveling to my uncle's ranch. I have nowhere else to go. There was something in her voice, a loneliness that matched my own, that made me want to turn around in the saddle and look at her face. But I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, focusing on the growing darkness and the need to find shelter for the night. We found a small cave in the rocks just as the last light faded from the sky. It wasn't much, just a shallow depression protected from the wind and large enough for 2 people to sleep without being on top of each other, but it would keep us warm and hidden from any unwanted visitors. I unsaddled Conscience and let her graze on the sparse grass near a small spring I'd discovered behind the rocks. Elena gathered what dry wood she could find while I built a small fire near the mouth of the cave. We had jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags, along with a small pot for making coffee. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was hot and filling. As we ate, Elena told me more about herself. She'd grown up on her father's ranch in California, educated by private tutors and groomed to marry well within the Spanish-speaking community there. But her father had lost everything in a series of bad investments and worse luck, and when he died, she'd been left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of introduction to her uncle in New Mexico territory. "I was traveling with a merchant caravan," she explained. "But we were attacked by bandits 3 days ago. Everyone scattered, and I've been wandering alone ever since. I thought I was going to die out here." "But you didn't give up," I observed. "Even today, when those men had you cornered, you were still fighting." She smiled for the first time since I'd met her, and it transformed her face completely. "My father used to say that Vasquez women were too stubborn to die easy. I guess he was right." As the fire burned lower and the night grew deeper around us, we talked about many things. She told me about her childhood in California, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, about the vast ranch her family had once owned. I found myself telling her things I hadn't spoken of in years, about growing up in Missouri, about the war and what it had done to men like me, about the slow slide from respectability to the desperate existence I'd been living. "You're not the same man who did those things," she said when I finished. "I can see it in your eyes. Whatever you were running from, you've left it behind. How can you be so sure?" "Because the man you used to be wouldn't have risked his life for a stranger. He wouldn't have cared enough." Her words hit me with unexpected force. Maybe she was right. Maybe the 3 years of wandering, of struggling to survive, of confronting my own demons in the vast emptiness of the frontier, had changed me in ways I hadn't fully realized. Maybe the weak man who had let pride and anger control his actions was finally dead, replaced by someone who could make the hard choices for the right reasons. We slept that night with the fire between us and our backs to the stone walls of the cave. But, despite the exhaustion of the day's events, sleep came slowly. I lay there listening to Elena's quiet breathing, acutely aware of her presence in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with a kind of spiritual recognition, as if I'd found something I didn't even know I'd been looking for. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed for the first time in years of a future that held more than just survival. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every distant mountain seem close enough to touch. Elena was already awake when I opened my eyes, sitting near the entrance to the cave and looking out at the vast landscape spread before us. She'd somehow managed to repair the worst of the damage to her dress and had braided her hair back in a practical style that made her look younger and more vulnerable. "Good morning," she said softly. "I've been watching the sunrise. It's beautiful out here, despite everything." I sat up and reached for my boots, working the stiffness out of my joints. "It grows on you. 3 years ago, I thought this country was nothing but desolation. Now I think it might be the most honest place on earth. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." "Is that why you stayed out here? For the honesty?" I considered the question while I saddled Conscience and packed our meager supplies. "Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't know where else to go." We rode out as the sun climbed higher, making good time across the relatively flat terrain. Elena had proven to be an excellent rider, adjusting her position on the horse instinctively to make the journey easier for all of us. More than that, she seemed to understand the rhythm of traveling through dangerous country, when to be quiet, when conversation was safe, how to scan the horizon for potential threats. It was around midday when we encountered our first real test of whether the events of the previous day had truly changed anything. We were approaching a small trading post, little more than a saloon, a general store, and a livery stable clustered around a well, when I spotted familiar horses tied up outside the saloon. "That's them," Elena said quietly, her body tensing against my back. "The leader and the one you wounded. They're here." I reined in Conscience behind a stand of cottonwood trees that offered some concealment while I studied the situation. The smart thing would be to wait for them to leave, or to circle around the trading post entirely. We had enough water and supplies to make it to Silver Creek without stopping, and avoiding another confrontation would be the prudent choice. But, as I sat there watching, I saw something that changed everything. A family, husband, wife, and 2 young children, was approaching the trading post from the opposite direction. They were clearly travelers, their wagon loaded with household goods, probably settlers heading west to start a new life. And they had no idea what was waiting for them inside that saloon. The old Will Harrison might have told himself it wasn't his problem, that he couldn't save everyone, that his primary responsibility was to get Elena safely to her uncle's ranch. But that man was dead now, killed by 3 years of learning the difference between survival and living, between existing and having a purpose worth the risk. "We can go around," Elena said, reading my thoughts. "There's no need to confront them again. Those people don't know what they're riding into," I said. "That leader strikes me as the type who doesn't forget a slight. He's probably been telling his partner all morning about how he's going to get revenge on the man who shot up his gang." "So you're going to risk both our lives for strangers? Again?" There was no accusation in her voice, just curiosity, as if she genuinely wanted to understand the thought process that could lead a man to make such choices. And, looking back, I think that was the moment I realized something important about Elena Vasquez. She wasn't questioning my decision because she disagreed with it. She was questioning it because she wanted to understand the man she was riding with. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, I said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside me. I read that in a book once, though I can't remember which one. Took me a long time to understand what it meant. And, what does it mean? It means that once you stop being afraid of who you really are, once you stop running from the hard choices, nobody else can touch the part of you that matters. Those men in there? They can kill my body, but they can't touch whatever it is inside me that chose to help you yesterday. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and, when she spoke, her voice carried a note I hadn't heard before, something that might have been pride, or admiration, or perhaps just recognition of a kindred spirit. Then, we'd better make sure they don't kill your body, she said. What's the plan? The plan, such as it was, relied on the element of surprise and the hope that the wounded man would be slower to react than he might otherwise be. I left Elena with Conscience in the trees, positioned where she could see the trading post but safely out of range if shooting started. Then, I circled around to approach the saloon from the back. The building was typical frontier construction, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a few small windows that had probably never seen glass, and a back door that hung crooked on leather hinges. I could hear voices inside, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Family coming up the road. Perfect targets. The man looks soft, probably has money. Still say we should go after that bastard who shot up our gang. Plenty of time for that later. Right now we got easier prey. I'd heard enough. These men were planning to rob and probably kill that innocent family, and all because I'd interfered with their original crime. They were now looking for easier targets to rebuild their confidence and their finances. The back door was unlocked. I eased it open just enough to slip inside, finding myself in a small storage room filled with barrels and crates. The voices were coming from the main room of the saloon, just beyond another door. Through a gap in the boards, I could see the two men sitting at a table near the front window, the leader with his arm in a makeshift sling, both of them watching the approaching family with predatory interest. There were no other customers in the saloon, and the bartender, an elderly man with the look of someone who'd seen too much trouble to want any part of it, was conspicuously absent from behind the bar. Smart man. I drew my Colt and stepped through the door into the main room. Afternoon, gentlemen. Fancy meeting you here. Both men spun around, hands moving toward their weapons, but I was ready for them. I wouldn't, I said conversationally. Last time we did this dance, you came out on the losing end. I'd hate for you to make the same mistake twice. The wounded man's hand froze halfway to his gun, but the leader's eyes were full of rage and calculation. You son of a bitch, he snarled. You killed my brother. Your brother was trying to rape an innocent woman. He made his choice, and he paid for it. Now you're sitting here planning to rob and murder a family with children. Seems like stupidity runs in your bloodline. What do you want? I want you to finish your drinks, get on your horses, and ride out of here. I want you to keep riding until you're so far away that I never have to see your faces again. And I want you to think long and hard about whether this life you're living is worth dying for. The leader laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do? You think because you got lucky yesterday that you're some kind of hero? I don't think anything, I said. I know that if you don't walk out of here right now, one of us isn't going to walk out at all. And I've got the drop on you, so the odds aren't in your favor. That's when the wounded man made his move. He was faster than I expected, considering his injury, but desperation can make a man quick. His gun cleared leather just as mine barked, and for a moment the saloon was filled with smoke and thunder. When it cleared, the wounded man was on the floor, clutching his chest, blood spreading across his shirt. The leader was staring at his dead partner with something like shock, as if he couldn't quite believe how quickly things had gone wrong. That's 2 of your friends I've killed, I said quietly. How many more have to die before you learn? For a moment, I thought he might go for his gun anyway. There was something in his eyes, a wildness, a rage that went beyond rational thought. But, then, he seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him all at once. This ain't over, he said, but there was no conviction in it now. Someday, somewhere, I'll catch up to you. Maybe, I acknowledged. But today isn't that day. Now get out." He looked at his dead partner one more time, then walked slowly toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "What's your name? I want to know who I'm going to kill." "Will Harrison." "And you're welcome to try, but you might want to practice your quick draw first." He spat in the dirt and mounted his horse, riding off toward the east without looking back. I watched through the window until he disappeared over a ridge, then turned my attention to the family that was just pulling up outside. They were decent people, the kind who still believed in the basic goodness of their fellow man, who hadn't yet learned to approach every stranger with suspicion. The husband was maybe 30, with the soft hands and pale skin of someone who'd spent his life indoors, probably a clerk or shopkeeper back east. His wife was pretty in a quiet way, holding a baby while a young boy peered out from under the wagon's canvas cover. I met them outside, tipping my hat to the woman and nodding to her husband. "Afternoon, folks. Beautiful day for traveling." "Indeed it is," the man said with a smile. "I'm Robert Clayton, and this is my wife Mary and our children. We're heading for California." "Will Harrison," I said. "I'd recommend against stopping here for very long. The previous customers weren't the kind of people you want your children around." Robert looked puzzled, but Mary seemed to understand. Women often had better instincts about danger than men, probably because they'd had to develop them to survive. "Thank you for the warning," she said quietly. "We'll just water our horses and move on." I helped them get what they needed from the well, all the while keeping an eye on the horizon. The leader might come back with reinforcements, or there might be other threats I hadn't seen yet. It wasn't until the Clayton family was safely on their way again that I allowed myself to relax. Elena was waiting where I'd left her, but she'd brought Conscience closer to the edge of the trees. When she saw me walking toward her, her face lit up with a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked almost like admiration. "I heard gunshots," she said. "I was afraid." "It's over," I said simply. "One of them won't be causing trouble for anyone else, and the other one rode off. The family is safe." She studied my face for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You could have just let them go. You could have waited for them to leave, and we could have continued to my uncle's ranch without any more violence." "Yes, I could have. But you didn't." "Why?" I thought about the question as I swung up into the saddle behind her. Why had I confronted those men again? Why had I risked both our lives for people I didn't even know? "Because that's who I am now," I said finally. "Not who I was 3 years ago, and not who I might have been if things had gone differently. But who I am right here, right now. And the man I am right now doesn't walk away when innocent people are in danger." We rode in comfortable silence for the rest of the afternoon, both of us lost in thought. The landscape began to change as we approached the Silver Creek Valley, the harsh desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and oak trees. It was prettier country, more welcoming, the kind of place where a man might think about putting down roots if he had a reason to stay. It was Elena who finally broke the silence, asking the question I'd been dreading since we'd left the trading post. "What will you do after we reach my uncle's ranch? Where will you go?" I'd been asking myself the same question, and I still didn't have a good answer. For 3 years, I'd been drifting from town to town, picking up work where I could find it, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments or obligations. It had been a lonely existence, but it had also been simple. No complications, no responsibilities beyond my own survival. But something had changed during these 2 days with Elena. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, not with fear or suspicion, but with a kind of respect I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a long time. Maybe it was the realization that I could be more than just a man running from his past, that I could be someone who stood for something, who made a difference in the world. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I suppose I'll keep moving, like I have been." "You don't have to." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I knew what she was suggesting, and part of me wanted nothing more than to say yes, to imagine a future where I could stay in one place, maybe find some kind of peace and purpose. But the larger part of me was afraid. Not of dying, I'd made peace with that possibility a long time ago. I was afraid of hoping for something better, of believing that a man like me could have the kind of life normal people took for granted. I'm not the settling down type, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. How do you know? When was the last time you tried? Before I could answer, we crested a hill and saw the Vasquez ranch spread out in the valley below us. It was an impressive sight, a large adobe house surrounded by outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and vast pastures where cattle grazed. This was clearly a successful operation, the kind of place that required dozens of workers and represented generations of hard work and careful planning. There it is, Elena said softly. Home. But there was something in her voice, not quite sadness, but perhaps a recognition that this wasn't really home, not in the way the California ranch had been. This was refuge, sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild her life from the ashes of what had been lost. As we rode down into the valley, I found myself studying her reaction to seeing the ranch. There was relief, certainly, and gratitude. But there was also something else, a kind of resignation, as if she were preparing herself to be grateful for whatever life her uncle was willing to provide, even if it wasn't the life she might have chosen for herself. The first person to spot us was a young vaquero mending fence near the road. He looked up as we approached, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across his saddle before he recognized Elena. "Señorita Elena," he called out in Spanish. "Don Carlos has been so worried. He sent men out looking for you days ago." Elena replied in rapid Spanish, explaining briefly what had happened. I caught enough of the conversation to understand that she was telling him about the bandit attack and the men who had tried to hurt her, and about how I had helped her. The young man's eyes grew wide as he listened, and, when he looked at me, it was with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Word of our arrival spread quickly through the ranch. By the time we reached the main house, half a dozen people had gathered in the courtyard, all talking excitedly in Spanish. And then, the front door of the house burst open, and a large man with graying hair and worry lines around his eyes came striding out. "Elena," he called out, his voice thick with emotion. "Mija, we thought, when your escort didn't arrive with the caravan, we feared the worst." Elena slipped down from the horse and ran to embrace her uncle. Watching them together, seeing the genuine love and relief in both their faces, I felt a sharp pang of something that might have been loneliness. It had been a long time since anyone had been that happy to see me safe. After several minutes of rapid Spanish conversation between Elena and her uncle, they both turned their attention to me. I was still sitting on my horse, suddenly, feeling like an outsider who had stumbled into a private family moment. "Uncle, this is Will Harrison," Elena said in English. "He saved my life. If not for him, I would never have made it here." Carlos Vasquez was a man who had clearly learned to size people up quickly and accurately. His eyes swept over me, taking in my worn clothes, my weapons, the wary way I sat my horse even here in the safety of his ranch. I could see him cataloging details, forming judgments, trying to decide what kind of man I was and whether I represented a threat to his family. "Señor Harrison," he said finally, extending his hand. "My family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Please, dismount. You are welcome in my home for as long as you wish to stay." I swung down from the saddle and shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of a man who still did his share of physical work despite his obvious prosperity. "I was glad I could help, Señor. Your niece is a remarkable young woman." "Yes, she is," he agreed, his eyes moving between Elena and me with the shrewd attention of a man who had noticed something in the way we interacted. "Please, come inside. You must be tired and hungry. Elena, you as well." Rosa has been beside herself with worry. The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, explanations, and the kind of overwhelming hospitality that seemed to be a trademark of the Vasquez family. I met Carlos's wife, Rosa, a warm woman who immediately took charge of making sure Elena had everything she needed. I was introduced to their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, all in their teens, all curious about the stranger who had brought their cousin home safely. Throughout it all, I found myself watching Elena, seeing her slowly relax as she was surrounded by family love and support. This was what she had needed, not just physical safety, but the emotional security of knowing she belonged somewhere, that she was valued and wanted. A guest room was prepared for me, and I was invited to stay for dinner. The meal was a feast: roasted beef, fresh vegetables from Rosa's garden, bread that was still warm from the oven. The conversation flowed easily, mostly in English out of courtesy to me, covering everything from the ranch operations to news from the territorial capital to gentle questions about my background and plans. It was during the meal that Elena made the announcement that changed everything. "Uncle Carlos," she said during a brief lull in the conversation, "I need to tell you something important. Will and we're married." The silence that fell over the table was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Carlos's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Rosa's eyes grew wide with shock. The three children stared at Elena as if she'd suddenly started speaking Chinese. "I beg your pardon?" Carlos said slowly. "We were married yesterday, after Will saved me from those men." "I know it seems sudden, but..." "Elena," I said quietly, "what are you doing?" She turned to look at me, and there was something in her eyes, a determination, a plea for trust, and, underneath it all, something that looked almost like fear. "It's true," she said firmly. "We were married by a traveling preacher we encountered on the trail. I know you had other plans for my future, Uncle Carlos, but I hope you can accept my choice and welcome Will into the family." The lie was so smooth, so confidently delivered, that for a moment even I almost believed it. But I could see the truth in her eyes. This was desperation, a woman making a desperate gamble to avoid some fate she considered worse than deception. Carlos was studying both of us with the sharp gaze of a man who had spent his life dealing with people who didn't always tell the truth. After a long moment, he set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "This is unexpected," he said carefully. "Elena, you know that I had hoped to arrange a suitable marriage for you, someone who could provide for you properly." "I know, Uncle. But I fell in love. Surely you can understand that." Rosa spoke up for the first time since the announcement. "Mija, marriage is not just about love. It's about family, about security, about building a life together. You barely know this man." "I know him well enough," Elena replied, reaching across the table to take my hand. Her touch was warm, but I could feel the slight tremor in her fingers. "I know that he risked his life to save a stranger. I know that he's brave and honorable and kind. What more do I need to know?" I could have spoken up then. I could have told the truth, explained that Elena was lying for reasons I didn't fully understand. But something in her eyes stopped me, a silent plea that seemed to say, "Please trust me, please help me, please don't destroy the only chance I have." So instead, I squeezed her hand and said, "I love your niece, Señor Vasquez. I know I'm not what you might have hoped for her, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her." The conversation that followed was awkward and stilted, with Carlos and Rosa clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. But, eventually, politeness and family loyalty won out over shock, and tentative congratulations were offered. Plans were discussed for a proper church ceremony to bless the marriage that had supposedly already taken place. Arrangements were made for us to stay in the guest quarters until more permanent accommodations could be arranged. It wasn't until much later, after the family had retired for the night, that Elena and I had a chance to talk privately. We met in the courtyard behind the house, both of us too keyed up from the day's deceptions to sleep. "Why?" I asked without preamble. "Why did you tell them we were married?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars scattered across the vast New Mexico sky. When she spoke, her voice was so soft I had to strain to hear her. "Because my uncle is a good man, but he's also a traditional man. He believes a woman needs a husband to be complete, to be safe, to be respectable. If I had arrived here unmarried, he would have immediately begun looking for suitable candidates, men who could provide for me financially, men from good families with proper connections. And what's wrong with that?" She turned to look at me, and in the moonlight I could see tears glistening in her eyes. "Because I've seen what that kind of marriage looks like. I watched my mother fade away, bit by bit, married to a man who saw her as a prize to be displayed, a vessel for producing heirs, anything but, a person with her own thoughts and dreams and desires." I was beginning to understand, but I needed to hear her say it. "So you claimed me as your husband to avoid an arranged marriage?" I claimed you because you're the only man I've ever met who saw me as a person worth saving, not a prize to be won. You risked your life for me when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You treated me with respect and kindness when you could have taken advantage of my helplessness. Elena. I know it's not fair to you, she continued quickly. I know I've put you in an impossible position. If you want to tell them the truth, I'll understand. I'll find some other way to handle my uncle's expectations. I stood there in the moonlight, looking at this remarkable woman who had just turned my world upside down, and realized that she had given me something I'd been searching for without knowing it, a reason to stop running, a purpose beyond mere survival, a chance to be the man I'd always hoped I could become. There's just one problem with your plan, I said finally. Her face fell. What? If we're going to be married, don't you think we should at least know each other's middle names? The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. Mine is Esperanza. It means hope. Mine is James, after my grandfather. Well, James Harrison, she said, as if testing how it sounded. I like it. Elena Esperanza Harrison, I replied. It suits you. We talked until dawn, sitting in that courtyard, sharing stories and dreams and fears. We talked about her childhood in California, about the books she'd read and the places she hoped to see someday. I told her about the war, about the men I'd served with and lost, about the long journey that had brought me to that canyon where I first heard her scream for help. As the sun began to rise over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Elena asked me the question I'd been dreading. Do you regret it? Agreeing to this deception? I considered the question seriously, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 3 days ago, I'd been a man with no future, no purpose, no reason to believe that tomorrow would be any different from yesterday. Now I was sitting here watching the sunrise with a woman who had somehow seen past all my failures and mistakes to something worth saving. No, I said finally. I don't regret it. But I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we make this real, I won't be the kind of husband who tells you what to think or who to be. I won't try to control you or diminish you or turn you into someone you're not. What kind of husband will you be? The kind who believes that a marriage should be a partnership between equals. The kind who thinks a woman's dreams are just as important as a man's. The kind who fell in love with your courage and your strength and has no intention of trying to change either one. She reached out and took my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. And I'll be the kind of wife who believes that a man can change, that the mistakes of the past don't have to define the future, that love is something that grows stronger through trust and respect and shared purpose. As we sat there watching the sun climb higher into the clear New Mexico sky, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The man who had spent 3 years running from his own shadow was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to stop running and start building. The weak self that had been controlled by pride and anger and fear was dead, and in its place was someone who could make the hard choices, who could stand up for what was right, who could love and be loved without reservation. Later that morning, Carlos found us in the courtyard and asked to speak with me privately. We walked out to the edge of his property, looking out over the vast rangeland where his cattle grazed. I want you to know, he said without preamble, that I don't believe for a minute that you and Elena were married yesterday. My heart sank, but I kept my expression neutral. Sir? Elena is a good girl, but she was never a good liar. And you, Senor Harrison, have the look of a man who has spent years being very careful about what he says and to whom he says it. Then, why didn't you expose us last night? Carlos was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon. Because I've seen the way she looks at you. And, more importantly, I've seen the way you look at her. Whatever brought you two together, whatever desperate circumstances led to this deception, I believe the feelings between you are real. They are. Elena's father was my brother, and I loved him dearly. But he was a dreamer, a man who believed that good intentions were enough to overcome bad decisions. He lost everything because he refused to see the world as it really is. I don't want the same thing to happen to Elena. It won't, I said firmly. I won't let it. See that you don't. Because if you hurt her, if you take advantage of her trust or her desperation, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and make you regret the day you were born. I'd expect nothing less from a man who loves her. Carlos studied me for another long moment, then nodded slowly. There's a small house on the north section of the ranch, about 2 miles from here. It needs work, but it's structurally sound. If you're serious about building a life with my niece, you can have it. I can also offer you work. I need men who know how to handle themselves, men who can protect what we've built here. I appreciate the offer, but I should tell you that I'm not much of a rancher. I know horses, but cattle are a different matter. You can learn. What I need more than anything is men I can trust, men who will stand and fight when trouble comes. And trouble will come, Senor Harrison. There are men in this territory who would like nothing more than to take what we've built and claim it as their own. I thought about his offer as we walked back toward the house. A job, a place to live, a chance to build something lasting with Elena. It was more than I dared to hope for just a few days ago. But it was also the end of my wandering days, the end of the freedom that came from having no ties and no obligations. I'll need to discuss it with Elena, I said finally. Of course. But don't take too long to decide. Winter comes early in this country, and if you're going to make that house livable, you'll need to start soon. The months that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Elena and I were married in a proper church ceremony 2 weeks after our arrival at the ranch, with Father Miguel performing the service and half the territory in attendance. It was a beautiful wedding, made more meaningful by the fact that we were already partners in every way that mattered. We moved into the small house Carlos had offered, and spent our days working side by side to make it into a home. Elena proved to be remarkably practical, with a talent for organization and an endless store of energy when it came to improving our living conditions. I learned that she could cook, sew, manage household accounts, and shoot a rifle with surprising accuracy. I threw myself into learning the ranch business with the same intensity I'd once applied to simply staying alive. Carlos was a patient teacher, and his vaqueros accepted me gradually as they saw that I was willing to work hard and learn from my mistakes. The physical labor was demanding, but it was also satisfying in a way that my previous aimless existence had never been. But, more than anything, I learned what it meant to be truly married, not just legally bound to another person, but genuinely partnered with someone who understood and accepted me completely. Elena and I talked about everything, our fears, our hopes, our plans for the future. We disagreed sometimes, even argued occasionally, but always with the underlying certainty that we were on the same side, working toward the same goals. It was Elena who suggested that I write down my thoughts and experiences, who encouraged me to put into words the lessons I'd learned during my years of wandering. You have wisdom to share, she said one evening as we sat on our small porch watching the sunset. And there might be other men out there who need to hear that it's possible to change, that the past doesn't have to control the future. So I began to write, slowly at first, just a few pages here and there about the nature of strength and weakness, about the choices that define a man's character, about the courage it takes to destroy the worst parts of yourself so that something better can grow in their place. The central truth I kept returning to was the idea that real strength comes not from the ability to overpower others, but from the willingness to face and overcome your own limitations. The man who destroys his weak self, the part of him that is controlled by fear, pride, anger, and selfishness, becomes invulnerable to the worst that others can do to him. Not because he can't be hurt or killed, but because his sense of worth and identity no longer depends on external circumstances. I wrote about the difference between surviving and living, between existing and having a purpose. I wrote about the courage it takes to help others when you have nothing to gain and everything to lose. I wrote about love, not the romantic fantasy that dominates popular stories, but the deep partnership that comes when two people choose to trust each other completely and work together toward shared goals. Most of all, I wrote about hope, the revolutionary idea that a man can change, that the worst mistakes don't have to be permanent, that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the hard work of transformation. Elena was my first and most important reader, offering suggestions and encouragement as the pages accumulated. But word of my writing began to spread throughout the territory, and I found myself receiving visitors, men who had heard that someone was putting down in words the truths they'd learned through hard experience but had never been able to articulate. Some came seeking advice about their own struggles with weakness and failure. Others came to share their own stories of transformation and redemption. Still others came simply to test themselves against someone who had developed a reputation for being difficult to intimidate or deceive. It was one of these visitors who brought news that would test everything I'd learned about strength and wisdom. His name was Tom Mitchell, and he rode into our yard on a cold morning in late October, 6 months after our wedding. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal, a lean man with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of dealing with dangerous people. "I'm looking for Will Harrison," he said without preamble. "You found him," I replied, not moving from where I sat on the porch, cleaning my rifle. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" "There's a man looking for you. Goes by the name of Jake Coulter. Says you killed his brother and he's got a score to settle." Jake Coulter. The leader of the gang that had tried to assault Elena, the man I'd let right away that day at the trading post. I'd wondered from time to time if he would make good on his threat to find me, but, as the months passed peacefully, I'd begun to hope that he'd found easier targets to focus his attention on. "Where is he now?" I asked. "Last I heard, he was in Alamogordo, gathering men. Word is he's put together a new gang, maybe 6 or 7 men, all of them looking to make a reputation by being the ones who brought down Will Harrison." Elena had come out of the house when she heard the marshal's voice, and now she stood beside my chair, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I could feel the tension in her touch, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say," Mitchell replied. "He's been talking big in the saloons, but talk is cheap. Could be he's just trying to build up his courage with whiskey and bragging. Could be he'll be here tomorrow. What do you recommend, Marshal?" "Honestly? You could come with me. There's a warrant out on Coulter for robbery and murder in 3 counties. You could testify against him, and I could guarantee your safety while he's being tried and hanged." "And if I don't want to run?" Mitchell studied me for a long moment, taking in my calm demeanor, the way Elena stood beside me without fear, the obvious prosperity and peace that surrounded our small home. "Then, I'd say you've built something worth fighting for here," he said finally. "But I'd also say that 6 or 7 desperate men are long odds for any one person, no matter how skilled." After Marshal Mitchell left, Elena and I talked long into the night about our options. We could run, as he'd suggested, pack up our belongings and disappear into the vast territory, start over somewhere else under new names. We could ask Carlos for help, though that would mean involving the entire ranch in our troubles. Or we could stay and face whatever was coming. "What does your heart tell you?" Elena asked as we sat by the fire in our small parlor. "My heart tells me that running away would be like going back to the man I used to be," I said. "For 3 years, I ran from my mistakes, from my responsibilities, from the consequences of my actions. I'm not that man anymore. And, if you die? What happens to us then, to the life we've built together?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of my dilemma. Was it selfish to risk my life, and, by extension, our future together, for the sake of principle? Was true strength sometimes found in choosing to run rather than fight? "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I know that if I run now, if I let fear make this decision for me, then I'll always be running. There will always be another threat, another reason to abandon what we've built and start over somewhere else." Elena was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice carried the same determination I'd heard that first day when she'd stood up to her attackers with nothing but a broken piece of wood. "Then, we stay," she said. "We stay and we fight for what's ours." "Elena, you don't understand. These aren't honorable men looking for a fair fight. They're killers who will do whatever it takes to win. If they can't get to me directly, they might try to get to you first." "Let them try," she said fiercely. I didn't survive everything I'd been through to be frightened away by a gang of cowards who prey on the innocent. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that I'd married the right woman. Not because she was willing to fight, although her courage never ceased to amaze me, but because she understood that some things were worth fighting for, that there came a point where standing your ground was more important than personal safety. We spent the next few days preparing. I cleaned and checked all our weapons, made sure we had adequate supplies of ammunition, and reviewed the layout of our property to identify defensive positions and escape routes. Elena proved to be an excellent strategist, with insights about potential weak points in our defenses that I might have missed. We also took the time to write letters to Carlos and Rosa, explaining the situation and our decision to face it rather than run, to Marshal Mitchell, in case we needed to get word to the authorities, and to each other, saying the things that might not get said if the worst happened. If I don't survive this, I told Elena as we sealed the letters, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You saved me in ways that have nothing to do with bullets and bandits. If you don't survive this, she replied with a smile that was equal parts love and fierce determination, I'll hunt down Jake Coulter myself and make him regret the day he was born. But that's not going to happen, because we're going to face this together and we're going to win. They came on a Tuesday morning in early November, riding hard across the range with their guns drawn and murder in their eyes. There were 7 of them, just as Marshal Mitchell had predicted, led by Jake Coulter himself. They'd expected to find me alone, or perhaps with Elena cowering in the house. Instead, they found us ready. Elena had positioned herself at the bedroom window with a clear view of the front approach, her rifle steady and her aim true. I was on the porch, my back to the house wall, with a clear field of fire in 3 directions. We'd rehearsed this scenario a dozen times, and we moved now with the smooth coordination of a team that had learned to trust each other completely. Coulter called out when they were still 50 yards away, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. Will Harrison. Come out and face me like a man. I'm right here, I called back. You're the one who rode onto my property with 6 men backing you up. Which one of us is acting like a man? You killed my brother. Your brother was trying to rape an innocent woman. He made his choice and he paid for it. Same choice you're making right now. Coulter's response was to spur his horse forward, his gang following. That's when Elena proved that she was every bit as deadly as she was beautiful. Her first shot took one of the riders clean out of his saddle before they'd closed half the distance. Her second shot spooked another man's horse, sending him tumbling to the ground. I opened fire a moment later, my shots carefully placed and devastatingly effective. 2 more men went down before they reached the yard, and a third was clutching a wounded arm. But Coulter and 1 other man made it to cover behind our well, and from there they began a steady barrage of gunfire that kept us pinned down. The wounded man had crawled behind a water trough, and together the 3 of them had enough firepower to make any movement dangerous. Give it up, Harrison. Coulter shouted during a brief lull in the shooting. You can't win. Sooner or later you'll run out of ammunition. So will you. I called back. And, when you do, I'll still be here. What followed was a battle of patience and precision, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. Elena proved to be an excellent marksman, consistently driving back any attempt to advance on the house. But our opponents were experienced fighters too, and they seemed content to wait us out. The stalemate was broken by the arrival of an unexpected ally. Carlos Vasquez appeared on the ridge behind our house with half a dozen of his best vaqueros, all of them armed and clearly ready for a fight. He'd heard the gunfire and correctly guessed what was happening. The sight of reinforcements was enough to break the will of Coulter's remaining men. The wounded man threw down his weapon and surrendered immediately. The other one tried to run but was quickly surrounded and captured. Coulter himself wasn't quite ready to give up. He made one last desperate charge toward the house, his rifle blazing, screaming curses and threats. He was brave, I'll give him that, but bravery without wisdom is just another word for foolishness. My final shot caught him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt of our front yard. He was still alive when I reached him, but barely. Should have killed you, that first day. He gasped. Maybe, I agreed. But you didn't, and now it's over. This ain't over, there's others who'll come. Let them come, I said quietly. I'm not running anymore. He died a few minutes later, and with him died the last remnant of my old life, the final thread connecting me to the man I used to be. I stood there in my own front yard, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd become, a man who could protect what he loved, who could face his enemies without flinching, who had finally learned the difference between strength and violence. Elena came out of the house and stood beside me, her rifle still in her hands, her face flushed with the aftermath of battle but her eyes clear and steady. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yes," I said, putting my arm around her. "It's over." Carlos and his men helped us deal with the aftermath, burying the dead, tending the wounded, making sure that the authorities were notified of what had happened. Marshal Mitchell arrived the next day and confirmed that all of Coulter's men were wanted for various crimes. There would be no legal complications from our defense of our home. But, more than that, word of the battle spread throughout the territory, carrying with it the message that Will and Elena Harrison were not people to be trifled with. We never had trouble with outlaws again. Our reputation for being both fair and dangerous became part of the local folklore. In the years that followed, our little ranch prospered. We raised cattle and horses, built additional outbuildings, and established ourselves as respected members of the community. Elena started a school for the children of the area, becoming known as one of the finest teachers in the territory. I continued to write, eventually publishing a book about the principles that had guided my transformation from a weak, directionless man into someone who could stand for justice and defend what was right. We had children, 3 daughters and 2 sons who grew up knowing that strength came from character rather than force, that true courage meant standing up for others rather than just yourself, and that the measure of a person was found in how they treated those who couldn't defend themselves. But, through it all, the central truth that had emerged from my encounter with Elena remained the cornerstone of everything I believed: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Not because he becomes invincible, but because he becomes something greater than his circumstances, something that transcends the petty fears and selfish desires that control weaker men. Elena and I grew old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that we had built something lasting and good. And, when people asked me about the secret to our happiness, about how a drifter and a refugee had managed to create such a rich and meaningful life together, I always gave them the same answer. We saved each other, I would say. But, more than that, we learned that saving someone else is really just another way of saving yourself. The weak man I had been died in that canyon where I first heard Elena's cry for help. The strong man I became was born in the moment I chose to ride toward danger rather than away from it. And the life we built together was proof that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most extraordinary transformations. In the end, that's what this story is really about, not the gunfights or the dramatic rescues, but the simple truth that we all have the power to choose who we want to be, regardless of who we've been. The man who destroys his weak self, who refuses to be controlled by fear or selfishness or pride, becomes someone who cannot be broken by external forces because his strength comes from within. Elena claimed me as her husband that night at her uncle's ranch, but the truth is that we claimed each other, 2 broken people who found in their partnership the strength to become whole, 2 lost souls who discovered that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to save someone else. And if that's not worth fighting for, then nothing is.